Hi, in this video I want to talk briefly about structures you can see kind of when you cut the brain in half. So we're going to call this a sagittal view. So it's basically if you went right down the middle of your brain, what you would see. We're going to get sort of the basic outline here. So let's talk about some important parts. So first of all, your brain across the top of it has a longitudinal fissure, which sort of separates the two halves from each other. So you'd say, well, if they're separated from each other, why would we ever have to cut them in half? And it's because, we've got this thing here called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the two halves of the brain. And that's because they do need each other. They do a lot of separate processing. They also need each other for certain functions to coordinate certain things. Below the corpus callosum, we've got this structure here called called the third ventricle. So ventricles are sort of holes in your brain, and they're supposed to be there. But on the walls of it, we've got thalamus right here and the hypothalamus right there. So the part of the purpose of ventricles is they create cerebral spinal fluid, which is sort of the fluid your brain sets in. Now we've got over here behind this there's a membrane there, and behind that you've got a lateral ventricle on each side of your brain, and that feeds the fluid that your brain sort of sits in into this third ventricle. And then that fluid comes down here, and it forms, first of all, part of your spinal fluid. But on the way, it also gets to this thing called the fourth ventricle. You might be wondering, well, we've got a third ventricle and we've got a fourth ventricle. Where are the other two ventricles? Well, like I said, behind here you've got a lateral ventricle. You have one on each side, so those would be the first two. Also, it's important to note here, we talked about the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is right here. So if you were to cut it in half, you would see one half of it. If you were to cut the brain in half, you'd see one half of it right here. So these are sort of the structures that you don't see when the brain is not cut in half, essentially when it's normal. You've also got here the pons right there, and then you've got just below it this thing called the medulla, I guess you could call it. So these are essentially the main structures that you'll see inside your brain, and we've talked about a couple of their functions, but for this video I think we'll just restrict it to what you see in the different parts of your brain.